Outlining is, I think, a constant evolutionary process for me, at least. I'm still trying to find um, how much I like to plan out ahead of time and how much I don't. I used to be very much like, oh no, like, I don't need to outline. I have it
Yeah.
all in my head. And, I've talked to people um, who definitely have this approach and like, oh yeah, like, and like, it's almost as if they look down on outlining and like have
Yeah.
a little bit of like, well, I don't need to because I have it all in my head. And, I used to be kind of like this. And then I realized what I believe to be a truth, which is that you simply cannot keep everything in your head so organized. Um, at least enough.
And I think you simply cannot just go with the flow
Yeah, I think
utterly. Anyway, yeah.
as in a lot of things in life, like I think to be intentional has so many benefits, and I think if your story has any complexity, it is very difficult just to be like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna write it off the top of my head. Like maybe you can do that, but your first draft is gonna be very simple and very full of mistakes because you're gonna write one draft and you're gonna look back and be like, oh, this is awful. I need to change
Yeah.
so much because by the end of the draft, you're gonna have so many better ideas.
Yes.
And this is what I think we both encountered with the first stories we tried to write is we're like, yeah, like gung ho, like I'm just writing the story and you have some vast vision in your head. And then you write like a few hundred pages and you're like, wow, this is such a mess. And, maybe for me, like I did several revisions before I realized like this is just not the way to go about this. And at that point, I was more closely analyzing books I would read, and if you read books like I mean, Name of the Wind is not even a very complex book. There's only one POV character. But if you read a book like that, um, you do see that there's a lot of foreshadowing about things, And I doubt Rothfuss just sat down and was like, I'm going to write a story and like put in all this
Yeah.
foreshadowing just off the top of his head. No, I think he planned it out. And if you read, like Game of Thrones, like I guarantee he planned it out. He just, Martin didn't just write that off the top of his
Yeah.
head. And so many books that I admire, I realized that the benefit of outlining is you can, one, put in a lot of foreshadowing, which is, that can be really important. Not every book needs a ton of foreshadowing. It depends on the story you're trying to tell,
It is
but
so cool though.
it's really cool, And
And more broadly, just a character arc.
yeah. Yeah, I mean that's
It's
what
not necessarily foreshadowing, but it is just everything should be connected.
yeah, that's where I was going to go next is, foreshadowing, yeah, however much you want it. But aside from that, simply the story,
Yes.
To keep you on track and focused on telling the story you want to tell and the character's journey that you want to tell and being able to tie everything together in a way that's cohesive and doesn't just do what, my original stories would do, which was just like wander everywhere. Like, oh, like I feel like talking about this now and like I would go into a scene and it would just kind of play out however I was feeling in the moment. Oh, maybe,
Yeah.
they'll have this conversation and then there'd be like a 4-page conversation that wasn't necessarily related to anything.
Yeah.
It was just like I was like, maybe this is an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
And sometimes
It's like, oh,
it's
I
okay.
haven't had a battle in a while.
Yeah, like I'm gonna have, like a wolf come out of the woods for some excitement and attack them. And like that'll be exciting, yeah, then you just write it in. And like sometimes looking back, and I remember this, I don't remember if it was something I thought of on my own or if you pointed it out after reading something I'd written. I had some sequence where there's the classic like company traveling through hostile lands and they get attacked by this monster thing and they defeat it and they keep going. And at some point I looked back on that part and I was like, that plays absolutely no role in anything in the story. Like, it's just a random monster that attacks them, and they defeat it, and there's no consequence on their journey, on the characters' art, character
Yeah.
arcs, nothing. And I was like, huh, that's probably bad to have something like that in a story that it has no influence on anything. And I mean, that was very early on, and since then, I've started to realize more and more how, you know, if you have a very specific story you want to tell, which I think you should, you want to have the intentionality of being like, okay, this is what needs to happen to make this the most impactful. I know you don't like that word.
No,
The most
I don't know why you'd use
impacting
it instead of impacting.
story, and otherwise you're gonna write like 2,000 pages because you're gonna be rambling all over the place, and it's hard to stay focused unless you have an outline that's saying, like, this is where you're going, this is where you need to get to, and that that can really direct your focus.
Yeah, and those 2,000 pages are all going to be a display of maybe how well you can write an engaging conversation, but a conversation that's just isolated from the rest of the story.
Yeah.
It's not part of a consistent vision that contributes to this kind of complex. You can just have such complexity. Like Rothfuss talks about, how carefully each word is chosen, and each time you read it, you can just see deeper and deeper and deeper. Each little, frown, each little moment of sadness, each little hint is just part of this very complex tapestry of all these things that are interwoven, and I really don't think you can get that without outlining. I just don't think it's possible. I don't think it's realistic. I don't think it even really makes sense. Like,
Yeah.
it seems to me that the entire essence of a complex, thought out, foreshadowing rich story is through this sort of planning, someone that has the vision and the intelligence and the intentionality to think it through at such a detailed level. Now, I think there is a place for inspiration, and I think maybe, our subconscious can know things and connect things and plant these little seeds that we can't consciously think through. But I don't think that can be the approach for just writing out an entire story.
Yeah. Yeah, and let's see, I had a thought that I wanted to say a moment ago when you were talking. Like, yeah, obviously leave some room for a book, a book being, you do want it to be a representation of you as well, and any author is going to put parts of themselves into the book that they're writing, and, some more than others, you can determine kind of how much you want to do that. But if you're having some contemplation, some things you've been pondering, some emotional struggles in a specific time in your life, like, it's not bad just to, like, infuse that somewhat into the book, because that'll make it authentic, If you have some thoughts that are very unique to your life, very human, and you kind of, put some of those into the book, other people are going to be like, wow, this is really, this isn't just some story she pulled off a shelf and wrote down, like, this was coming from her. And, these things you can't always plan out ahead of time. So, like, that's,
moments,
that's totally the little, like, pieces of introspection. That's totally good. But I think, and maybe some people who are not big advocates of outlining would say, like, oh, I'm portraying it like, real life. I think I used to think that when I was a kid and I was writing, and I was like, this conversation isn't necessarily applicable to anything in the story, but it's happen. Like it would happen. It's real life. Like, people go through their lives and they're not like only talking about the mission at hand, or like they have these little conversations about random things that are interesting, and that's what builds them as characters. I'm like, like, put it in the book. But it's like, if you're going to do that with everything, then your book's going to be really long. It's just like, in a movie, you're
telling a story.
Yeah, you're telling a story. And how you tell a story is by picking what should be told to tell this specific story. You're not going to have a movie like, you're not going to be watching the movie, Lord of the Rings, or any movie, doesn't matter the genre, and have the characters be like, well, I have to go to the bathroom right now. Like, no, like, that's what people would be like, what, that's the 20th time it's happened. Well, they've been on the road for 5 days. Of course, you would go to the bathroom 20 times in 5 days. Like, no, you don't,
this is just
that's realistic. You don't need to tell what's realistic. You don't need to tell everything. You tell what contributes to the story.
Yes. Yeah, that's interesting, because it can, obviously that's an extreme example, but it can become hard to see. It can become hard to distinguish exactly, especially for beginning writers. That's why, the more streamlined or more minimalistic, more fast-paced stories seem to start appealing more and more as I grow older. Even though I appreciate poetic prose, even though I appreciate complex, certainly complex characters, stories, complex stories, but even though I appreciate complex style, whatever, elaborate descriptions of the feast or the palace, like I do like appreciate a rich world. I do like a rich religion. I do, but I find myself graduating ever towards more streamlined things where everything is actually contributing to the story, and it can become hard to tell, like the temple or the religion, the gods, the goddesses, what sort of care this man takes for his armor. These things, it can be like, wow, that's a powerful, rich thing that, is unique to him, is unique to this world. These gods display the metaphorical question, the powers, the metaphorical good versus evil worldviews that are in tension here, and so I should put those in, and it can be hard to tell what's contributing to the story and what's not. So it is a tricky thing.
And because in some moments you might think like, okay, this conversation, this dialogue that I'm writing, it's not like necessarily moving the story forward, but maybe it's revealing something about the character. And like you said, this can be really nebulous territory, because sometimes, you could write endless dialogues revealing stuff about the character, but you can't put them all in the book. There's not enough room for that. But some might be necessary and good, even if it's just some idle conversation. I think as long as the scene has a deliberate, goal in your mind, where you're like, okay, why I put this scene in the book was, for this reason. Even if it's just, even, Rothfuss has scenes with Quoth and his friends just chatting about something, not necessarily something important. But as a reader, like, I enjoyed those scenes because it let me see the dynamic between them. It let me continue to build in my mind the relationship between the friends, because, for example, in that Quoth's friendship with, like, Will and Sim, his two main friends, you spend a lot of time, like, never actually being with them together. He spends a lot of time just referencing them, or like, oh, they're going to the university together, Quoth and Will and Sim, but they're off doing something else. You're not actually physically with them. And so it's important to sometimes have a scene with the three of them bodily together, even if they're not talking about, like, anything super important.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Huh. So for you, in your process, going back to kind of how you build your stories, what would you say your process is? Kind of from the ground up. Do you start off with an idea and then,
I mean,
sorry, I had like two questions and I wasn't sure which one I wanted to ask.
Yeah, no, but I mean, it's really all tied back to the question number 3 that you outlined in the beginning of, like, how I outline. And I think I start mainly with like the most unique idea of the story that stands out to me, of, and maybe it's just something I wrote in my notes, one sentence, about, usually character focused, usually not like, oh, I had this idea about the world and the Dark Lord and how it was going to end. Usually it's like, oh, what if I had a character who had this family situation, because to me, those are the most interesting things usually, is the small, like the character and their relationships with other people. And like, what if I had this dynamic of, like, maybe a widow who has a young child, but her child's been taken away because of, she was in debt. Maybe it's, medieval times, and
that's how readers are gonna engage with the stories. Through the lens of the character.
Yeah, and this is what I learned kind of from reading non-fantasy books, like historical fiction. I was kind of surprised to find out, like, oh, you can have a super simple story about one person's life, and, like, I love this book and I'm way more emotionally engaged in this story than I am about, like, the fantasy world ending in doom and destruction, because I feel for the character so much. And so when I outline, I usually start with something like this, like, oh, just like, what if there's a character like this, and that piques my interest. And then Usually I kind of start to accumulate ideas from people I talk to, people's lives as, I travel and meet different people and ask them, hear some about their lives, and I encounter more interesting details. I draw a lot of inspiration from history, a lot of documentaries or books that I read about, medieval times, yes, but you can take any story from history and transplant it into,
Mm-hmm.
like writing it into a fantasy book or any book, like we talk about fantasy a lot because that's what we've written a lot, but you don't, it can apply, you can take any story from any time and a lot of the emotions can still apply no matter where you transplant it. So, I start to build the details from a lot of history, a lot of world events, and oh, this is interesting, this is interesting, this is provocative, and eventually I have some rough idea just from mulling over things for a while of like, okay, yeah, maybe this could happen, this could happen, and just like a very skeletal outline of bullet points.
Yeah, a character and the different powers that are tugging at him.
Yeah.
And what he's wanting, what he's working for.
Yeah, so focused initially on the character, and then slowly as I get more ideas, I'll fill in a bit of the peripheral context, and I'll start to my bullet point outline will start to expand into like paragraphs of like explaining motives, or like, oh yeah, like this side character could come and they're gonna interact in this way, and this is gonna cause this emotional transformation, and whatever, and start to just slowly build in the more ideas, more context, more outside characters, outside factors, until my outline has expanded into being many pages long.
Yeah.
And then you reach some point when you have to start working with the logistics of like,
yes,
okay, I got all my fun ideas down, and now it's like, okay, how is this gonna work?
Yeah.
How like you need to make things actually make sense. You need to make sure it's all cohesive and
yeah,
and all the parts fit together.
You usually start from a place of looking at his internal motivators and his internal weaknesses and the sort of internal journey that you'd like him to go on, right? The maturity that you would like him to reach, the fear you'd like him to overcome, the power you'd like him to unlock, whatever. Things that are internal. And then you want to make sure that those match with the external world. Is that a good way to describe it?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's a combination of, starting...
Or you start with an external world that has...
And how it influences, yeah.
But then there are still just lots of logistics.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like who killed who, and relationships and travel time.
And like, travel time, and okay, what this character... Because sometimes when I look back at...
That's what I meant.
At my initial outlines, I'll be like, oh yeah, like initially I was just throwing ideas out there, and I had like this character, killing this character, or simply, being aggressive toward them in some way. And like now, farther down the road, now that I have the characters more developed, I realize like that's not really congruent with how that character A would behave toward character B. That's I can't believe I wrote that in the first outline. Like, what was I thinking? Like, and so there's so much then of having to see what what works together and what's realistic, and trying to not lose sight of the personalities and characters and motives of all the characters, because sometimes you can be thinking so much along the lines of this is this character's strengths and weaknesses, and you can follow that vein for a little bit, and then suddenly you'll have a cool idea of a plot item, and be like, oh, then this could happen, and you want to make them work, but you need to pick what's actually gonna flow together, and sometimes you can't just like throw in some cool plot twist if it's not actually in line with their internal story. So like starting, just getting all the general flow chart down, and then
any examples of dilemmas you've run into where you really wanted, like for me it was these sci-fi book, my sci-fi novel I'm working on. These characters are on a ship and I wanted a certain hostage situation to take place where one of them is a little bit freaked out. He's worried about basically the ship's computer system overseeing things with too much power, being sort of totalitarian. He doesn't trust it. He takes a prisoner. I wanted him to take a hostage, and boom! I hope you like this excerpt from the Jesse Tate podcast. Click through to see the rest of this episode, or go to the channel to see more content like this. Thanks.